As promised in our previous video on Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, we are back this time with a look at the game's performance modes. We'll discuss the differences, we'll discuss the actual performance, and a whole lot more. But this time, because there is ray tracing involved, I felt that I had to at least get Alex Battaglia in on one of these videos. So Alex, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, John. I didn't want to cramp your style in the original video, but I'm happy to talk about ray tracing with you today.
I know you are. You're always ready to talk about it, and that's why we love you. It's the best. So yes, if you saw that original video, that was sort of a showcase kind of thing. You could see it's a very nice looking game. Probably one of the best we've seen thus far for this new generation of consoles.
Oh yeah.
And it's especially crazy to me that Insomniac has shipped this and Spider-Man within like 6 months of one another. While having also released their previous game, the full Spider-Man game, in 2018, and remastering it for PS5. I don't know how these guys do it. They're just absolute machines.
You know, they've also improved the visuals in certain aspects, like you in your video talked about them using now checkerboarding to get those reflections up to 4K, as well as a whole bunch of other things. So
exactly. We'll talk about all of that. So I guess, first of all, as you know, there are 3 modes in this game now, thanks to that most recent patch, and it was actually patched again after that last patch. I think they're just getting ready for launch at the time of making this video. So we have the default quality mode, which is how I initially played it. Then we have a performance mode without ray tracing, and lastly, the performance mode with ray tracing, just like Spider-Man.
And it looks like here the difference between the two, or the difference between the 3 modes, seems to come down mostly to resolution, as you found out so far. Should we start off first with the quality mode, since that's the one you talked about in your original video here?
Yeah, so that one, primarily that one aims for native 4K output, so 2160p. I found, counting it, that 1800p was kind of the lowest that I found. Most, like, it's sort of the lowest average, but it was often very close to hitting that 4K pixel count. But it can drop as low as 1296p in like the rarest instances. Like I would say it's not really representative of the actual normal resolution. So
yeah, that's
by and large, this is 1800 to 2160p.
That seems actually pretty normal based upon what we already saw in Spider-Man before this. I guess
precisely.
The next mode that we should talk about here is the performance mode without ray tracing. And this one, since, you know, they're not using ray tracing anymore, that gives them a lot of breathing room for that GPU, even though it's going up to 60 FPS. And here, the range tops out at 1800p. And from the screens John's been showing me, it looks like it's rather high resolution quite often, but it can, I guess, in those worst moments, like you were just describing earlier, go down to a minimum of 1080p. But I would imagine that's rather rare.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of values that they set for the game itself in order to ensure that there's a nice performance cushion to prevent frame drops. But by and large, it does seem to average out to... It does seem to hit 1800p most of the time. Usually when I've counted it, it's that or like a little bit lower, like 1620 range. So it's good. So the image quality is still excellent there. But lastly, of course, I guess the big one here is the performance mode with ray tracing, which tops out at 1440p and has a minimum of 1080p. And I guess the main thing here is that if I recall correctly here, the settings we have are basically identical to what was used in Spider-Man Miles Morales on PS5. So if you've played that game, you should have a pretty good idea of what to expect here. The only difference being the actual content of the visuals. The visuals themselves are very different than Spider-Man. And I would argue it ends up looking kind of cleaner in a way, because there's less of those like long, flat, open distances and tons of small distant objects. You know, it's just a busier looking scene, which in the end kind of works really well because they are still using their temporal injection, which I think is one of the better methods we've seen for achieving really high temporally stable image quality in a console game. So,
and I also think now, due to the in those modes we're using ray tracing, due to the change in reflection resolution, there's going to be less breakup and stuff, and less obvious aliasing inside edges. I think that's also a nice plus over Spider-Man here as well.
And you know what? That's actually a really important point. So obviously the reflections, we're actually not still sure how they managed to increase their ray budget so dramatically, to be honest,
right?
because you know,
When
this first arrived for us, the reflections were all 1080p, quarter res, or I guess I didn't actually get to see or check the performance mode without the patch.
But I guess been quarter res of whatever the
yeah,
output was. Yeah,
exactly. Which is basically the same as Spider-Man, which is to say it looks good, and that's kind of what I expected from console ray trace reflections. But they've obviously did some work there and managed to implement the checkerboarding solution in there. So you get the effective full pixel resolution of whatever the image is at that specific time, but obviously, you know, it's reconstructed. And that means, you know, for instance, when you're in the performance RT mode, I can go back to this club scene and I was able to pixel count this same edge, which counted out to 2160p in quality mode. Here it's 1260p, which also corresponds to the resolution of the scene as a whole in performance RT mode. So
yeah, you know, that's but still, even I think with this temporal injection, you'll see it like if we do side by sides here. John can show them off probably pretty easily with some screenshot examples here. You can definitely see the difference, but when you're not pulled back from the television, temporal injections on, you know, a lot of these visuals are going to be very similar. It's actually the difference in, I would say, graphical quality is the biggest one you'll see, like whether or not ray tracing's on. And I guess there's some other slightly different aspects about the visuals beyond resolution there, John.
Sure, so let's talk about that then. So quality versus performance RT mode. They noted things like crowd density and scene density in general, and some other minor tweaks to the image are made. And in most scenes, I found that it was very difficult to determine this because there's a lot of random objects, like in the city, for instance. There's all these vehicles and things flying around in the sky. There might be more in quality. There probably is, but it's really difficult to actually tell during gameplay because of the random nature of it. But I did find one example, the crowd during the introduction sequence. It is more sparse when using either performance mode, actually. And in fact, you can see the crowd kind of draw in and fill out as the camera gets closer to them. So there is a slight change there. So that's really the kind of things that you'll see.
I wonder if that's due to CPU limitations and not GPU ones.
That's kind of what I'm thinking, actually, because you know, ray tracing is also expensive on the CPU, and I feel like that's the kind of cut they would have probably have to have made to help support ray tracing at high frame rates.
For sure, yeah.
But also, I did notice things like the fur, for instance. It does seem to reduce the strand quality when using the performance mode. You'll actually see like the splines become reduced in quality and number as the camera pulls out. But again, it is difficult to see during normal gameplay. It's one of those things where you kind of have to pause and look closely.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. And, you know, honestly, if you're already rendering the game at a lower resolution anyway, you may not even see the difference in this hair from the normal camera distance. So that's a smart optimization.
I guess one other interesting thing about when you switch to photo mode, when using the ray traced performance mode, it actually does bump up the resolution and various other details. But it still has things like reduced screen density of like things like the crowds and other changes inherent to using that mode. So you end up with kind of this hybrid where the rendering resolution is very high, it goes up to 4K, and you know, everything that also includes reflections, of course. So everything improves in fidelity when you're using photo mode with the performance RT. But of course, quality mode in general is consistent with when you switch to photo mode. Their LOD management in general is really excellent in this game, and they are often using LOD 0, which is the cutscene model, directly into gameplay. But as the camera pulls in and out, they seem to make slight adjustments to it, but it's very difficult to tell. So
it's totally reasonable stuff, though. Like
very normal.
There's no reason to render detail that the resolution can't even resolve, so it's pretty normal. But in terms of differences that I think are really, really big, is that we were talking about it before we started this video, John, was the difference without ray tracing.
Yeah, that's huge.
That, you know, like in a game, kind of like you were showing off in your original Spider-Man video, but there's just so many shots in this game where, due to the material choices they made, it really does look like, in comparison to Spider-Man, that they, you know, authored a lot of this game's materials while they already had ray tracing in production.
Exactly. It does
So
look
they had a
that
good
way.
sense of, like, oh, we got to show off the reflections here. And, when you look back and forth, you can definitely see the huge differences. And I think one of the scenes that you showed off there where I was just like, yeah, I don't think I would want to play without RT on. It was just looking at any scene with Clank.
Yeah, exactly. Anytime Clank is there, his rounded head has ray traced reflections applied to it, so you can see both his body reflected in it, and when he's on Ratchet or Rivet's back, you also see the reflection of the character in his metallic shell. So when you take that away, it almost makes him look like he's more just floating there on the back of the character rather than like integrated properly into the scene.
Man.
And I love all these rounded reflective surfaces, by the way. And also this one introduction sequence here when Dr. Nefarious has his ship out here during the parade. You'll note he has this huge curved glass windshield. And at one point, the camera points directly at the windshield that fills the entire viewport. And you can see the reflections of all the cars and structures behind you buzzing around in the air. Whereas without ray tracing, it's literally just like there's nothing there outside of like the cloud texture. So,
Oh, man.
and I guess we should note, like just like Spider-Man, when you don't have ray tracing enabled, the game falls back on a combination of screen space reflections and cube maps, of course.
Yep.
So, which, totally normal, typical stuff that you would expect to see. And the SSR gets the job done in many scenes, but obviously you lose a lot of that depth. And also, there's a lot of rougher materials that received ray trace reflections, and the reflection itself sort of disperses correctly across the surface of that material. But when using screen space reflections, the variation is lessened dramatically.
Yeah.
So they all tend to have more of a mirror-like sheen to it, because it definitely loses a lot of the nuance in the surface, the granular surface detail, without ray trace reflections.
That's so interesting. And it just goes to show that, sometimes we're used to seeing the way games looked before with cube maps and screen space reflections, but they were just compromises. Sometimes the way materials are authored means that they even shine even brighter and look more correct with ray trace reflections on. And it's so cool to see here as well, too. But
yes, exactly.
So some pretty awesome differences there with the ray tracing on, but how does it perform, John?
Yes, so obviously that's the big question. First video, I showed the quality mode, and really there isn't much more to say here. It's 30 frames per second, and that's kind of it. That's the story, which isn't surprising. It's extremely solid, outside of which the intentional choice to have those extra, 60 millisecond dips that occur on frame cuts during cutscenes to ensure a consistency between every frame, which is, it's a minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but it's there. But it's not a typical kind of frame rate drop, because there really aren't any GPU or CPU driven performance bottlenecks in this game. So that's good.
That's good.
And the same is actually pretty much true from what I've seen of the performance mode without ray tracing. This one is also every bit as stable. It's just 60 frames per second instead of 30. I did notice occasional 16 millisecond dips, basically like a single frame here or there, but by and large it was very stable. But to me it actually kind of feels like there's quite a lot of headroom here perhaps, which we could see them maybe push beyond 60 frames per second. And I kind of wonder, so one of the things that they've done here that I think is interesting, when you switch to the performance mode, if your TV is capable of 120 hertz support, the game will switch the console to 120 hertz mode, unless you've disabled it, of course, right? And I think the idea here is to reduce the severity of any potential slowdown that could occur. And honestly, I didn't measure any, but I would imagine this would mean you'd have like an 8 millisecond drop on the frame time graph rather than a 16 millisecond drop.
Which feels a lot better, by the way. Because I don't know, I've played a lot of 60 FPS content on 120 hertz monitors, and the drops there without variable refresh rate feel so much better than the normal 60 to 30, 16.6 ms to 33.3 ms drops we're used to in games. And we've talked a lot about it before, that we've always wondered whether or not there could be 40 FPS modes in games. That'd be another interesting thing to see.
I would love to see that, actually.
That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, we talked about it on the recent direct, so definitely something worth pointing out. But that's pretty much quality and performance. I think the big thing to talk about here that everybody's wondering about is the ray trace performance mode. But you know what? This is also not that interesting from a performance perspective, and I mean that in the best possible way. I played through most of the stages in this game, some revisiting, some continuing my progress in this mode, and I had a very difficult time actually tracking down any significant drops. Like, some scenes I found, oh, here's a single frame drop where it persists for an extra frame.
Wow.
In one sequence, when flying to the planet, which looks like a colorful version of a stage from the game Rage by id Software, there is this very slight moment where the frame rate drops into the 50s during the introduction, like pilot down to the planet sequence. But once you're there and playing, it's fine.
Do you notice when these are happening? Do you notice like the resolution bottoming out at 1080p or something like that? Or do you think it's maybe, oh, this is CPU stuff actually?
Yeah, see, that's the thing, is it doesn't always seem to correspond to any drops in resolution necessarily. So it's very likely that it could be a CPU issue in those spots.
That'd be interesting.
So yeah, I mean, you know, looking at these three modes, I think for me the conclusion is pretty simple. The ray trace performance mode is the way to play it. It's absolutely worth giving up the difference in image clarity, which is not that significant, in a trade-off for ray trace reflections and 60 frames per second. It's really, really, really smooth, and it's just like Spider-Man. Really, I mean, it's the same thing. It's just like with that mode, there's almost no other reason to bother with the others.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel about this, where, you know, you're getting all of the advances essentially that you get in the ray trace quality mode, because the ray trace reflections are a huge part of this game's visuals, and you're trading that off for a bit of clarity and a bit of image stability, where I don't think that's ever worth it if you're going up to 60 FPS as well. So that's just awesome. And it's really great for people playing this game as well too, because unlike with Spider-Man, where it launched later, the first time you get to boot up this game as just a normal consumer not reviewing it, you can just be straight to 60 FPS RT without having, you know, like this thing where like, oh, should I wait till they maybe patch the game? No, it's coming out on launch, which is awesome.
That's absolutely key. This is there for everybody on day one, which is actually probably the day this video is going up. So that's great. And yeah, definitely use this mode unless you're completely okay with 30 FPS and don't mind and just want that higher resolution, because quite frankly, you know, maybe even it's similar to Spider-Man. I mean, the ray tracing usage is slightly different just due to the nature of the visuals, but I feel like it just doesn't look nearly as nice without the ray traced reflections. There's too many instances where they use it so effectively that it feels like the art itself was designed with that in mind, that when you take it away, it looks wrong, especially on all those, like, there's so much curved glass in this game, dude. It's everywhere, and it makes such a difference, especially the way they simulate how, you know, the actual reflection can flip correctly as it does in real life, you know, with certain glass shapes. And it's the same thing here. And when you see all those reflections parallaxing around you as you move through the world, it adds so much to the experience, and SSR and cube maps just can't match it.
They're just not good enough. And I know how I'd play this game. You know how you'd play this game. Let's just hope we can convince more people in the audience to play it that way.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it then. It's probably the best looking next gen game we've seen thus far. It's extremely performant. It has amazing ray traced reflections, and Insomniac is a machine. So
you know, at some point, John, we're gonna have to stop calling it next gen. I don't know what it is.
Why do I keep doing
one of these days?
Maybe after E3 we can just decide and say this is the current generation now.
Yeah, and we could start calling the last gen, like, I don't know, some very negative sounding thing that isn't last gen.
We could call it retro, which isn't negative. But...
Oh, you know, it's actually almost coming up, John, in about like 2 years. It reaches your retro threshold.
The retro threshold of 10 years. Yep, PS4 is almost retro, guys. It's happening sooner than later. Oh, boy. But anyway, thanks for joining me, Alex.
Of course, John.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Plus, check out the version over on our Patreon, because it is in full, super high quality in a way that's not really feasible on YouTube, unfortunately. So come check it out. But until next time, this is John and Alex signing off, and Alex, of course, saying...
Auf Wiedersehen.